Hello, good evening. I am Amy Lizer, and I am the Executive Director of the Monroe County Historical Association. Welcome. I am delighted that you have joined us for our first Third Thursday lecture series for 2020. This marks the fourth year of this popular program. And while we would all like to be gathered at the Stroud Mansion for this presentation, this format is certainly the next best thing. Okay, and here we have Rick Smith. I'm very happy to introduce him as tonight's speaker. Rick is a Monroe County native who lives in Jackson Township with his wife, Kelley. He retired from Sanofi Pasteur in Swiftwater after 44 years of service. He also served on the Pocono Mountain School Board for 23 years. Rick became interested in the Lusitania story more than 40 years ago when he read about a medal struck by a German artist celebrating the terrible event. The British made copies of the medal and used them for propaganda purposes to raise money for wounded soldiers. Rick knew he had to have one of those medals, and he also knew that he had to learn more about the sinking of the Lusitania. Rick, thank you so much for being with us tonight, for donating your time. We very much appreciate it, and we're all looking forward to your program tonight.
Thank you, Amy. So can everyone see that? Amy, can you see my program?
Yes, your program is up and running. Looks great.
All right, very good. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. As Amy said, this isn't the best way to do a historical presentation, but it certainly is the only one we have available to us right now. So I'd like to thank you for joining, and I'd like to thank the Monroe County Historical Association for hosting the webinar. I'm going to talk about the sinking of the Lusitania, but first I'd like to provide some details about the ship itself, the conditions that led up to the Great War, which is what the First World War was called back then. And I'd like to talk about the reactions that occurred after the sinking, and then finally talk a little bit about how the sinking was used for propaganda purposes. So throughout American history, we've been asked to remember key events. The first time the phrase was used was back in the early 1800s, or mid 1800s, 1836 to be exact, when we were asked to remember the Alamo. The Alamo, of course, was a Texas mission that was under siege from the Mexican army from mid-February until early March. It was 13 days that they held off the Mexican army, but finally were overcome and slaughtered. And the Texans, the remaining Texan army, asked everyone to remember the Alamo. And it was the rallying cry that actually brought an end to the war. Just the next month, they actually had enough people enlist and enough public fervor to take them to victory. The next time we were asked to remember something was to remember the Maine. This happened in 1898 when the U.S. battleship Maine was sunk in the Havana harbor. We still to this day don't know the full extent of what happened then or how it happened, but we were asked to remember the Maine, and it took us a month later into the Spanish-American War. Most of you remember the Pearl Harbor. Of course, that phrase was very popular throughout the mid to late 1900s. Remember Pearl Harbor. It was, of course, the day that the Japanese, in December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed our naval station at Pearl Harbor, and it was the direct link that put us into World War II. And we all remember 9/11. Who can forget that day, what you were doing and where you were, and we've been asked to remember that ever since. But in the middle of all of these events, we were also asked to remember the Lusitania back in 1915. And there were many things, many items that were put out for sale for the war effort and also for various programs. But usually it carried the phrase, "Remember the Lusitania." So here's an artist's rendition of the Lusitania as it was coming into the New York Harbor on its way to Pier 54 in the Chelsea Pier section of New York, which was the New York home of the Lusitania and the other Cunard luxury liners. This is an actual photo of the Lusitania, either coming in or going away from port. It's hard to tell without any kind of a background or scenery in the background. But the one thing we can tell is that it was not chugging along at full power because there's no smoke coming from the fourth funnel. And this, I'm going to ask you to remember that feature because later on, when we talk about the sinking itself, they were not operating at full power then. This is an artist's rendition of what the sinking must have looked like. There were no photographs, no iPhones or cameras that people could quickly take a photo. And in those days, you had to actually set up for a photo shoot, so it wasn't really something that could be done. So this is what the artist believed it looked like. Here's another artist's rendition. The notable point about this one is that you can also see in the on the right-hand side of the drawing, you can see the U-boat and the crew members of the U-boat standing on top of it. This was used for propaganda purposes with the intent of whipping up foreign anger. Although a submarine, supposedly the U-20, is shown with its crew members gawking at the frenzied activities of the survivors, there's no indication that the sub actually stayed around long enough to be seen. In reality, the sub commander felt he would be in danger of getting rammed by one of the responding boats coming to the rescue of the passengers. And he hightailed it out as soon as he could. So this is an artist's drawing, but not really realistic. And this is the Lusitania today, as it sits at the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of the Irish Sea, 295 feet below the surface. So let's talk a little bit about the Lusitania and some statistics behind that. The gross weight was over 31,000 tons. Its dimensions 762 feet by 87 feet. Now 762 feet is more than 2 football fields long, and 87 feet is more than the width of a football field. So you can imagine how big this ship was. It featured 4 funnels and 4 propellers or 4 screws, driven by 4 steam turbines. And those turbines were fueled by 25 boilers or 192 furnaces. It consumed 840 tons of coal per day. The engines delivered 76,000 horsepower to those turbines. It had a service speed of 25 knots. It was the fastest ship on the water at that time. It could hold 2,165 passengers in the classes that are listed, and a total of a crew of 850. So fully loaded, it had 3,000 people aboard. It was launched on the 7th of June, 1906. Its maiden voyage occurred on the 7th of September, 1907. And it was sunk on the 7th of May, 1915. A lot of sevens there. I would say that it wasn't such a lucky 7, but there were a lot of 7s in the dates. In fact, it was sunk on the 7th day of its final voyage across the Atlantic. And if you calculate the service time between the 7th of September of 1907 and the day it was sunk, it was actually in operation 7.7 years. So who owned the Lusitania? The Cunard Steamship Company Limited was the official owner, but who paid for it? The Great Britain's Parliament authorized payment of the building of the Lusitania and the Mauretania, sister ship that was built and really was just a few months behind the Lusitania. And Great Britain not only authorized the payment of it, they funded the loan to get it built. They contributed yearly to its operation by having an annual stipend, and they also had a royal, a mail, it was a mail ship. In fact, the RMS Lusitania stands for Royal Mail Ship. So there was also a mail contract that was also putting money into the operation of the Lusitania. So most of the operating expenses of the day were actually covered by the Great Britain's Parliament. So why? You might ask, why would a country do that? Why would they have a ship built for the ownership by a private company? And there were several reasons for that. One was to capture the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. The blue ribbon of the Atlantic was the distinction given to the ship that could cross the Atlantic from Europe to New York with the fastest average speed. Very important for luxury liners in those days, because they were competing with luxury liners that were from France, also from Germany and Holland. So it was very important to have naval superiority, but also to be the fastest on the sea. The Lusitania actually captured the blue ribbon of the Atlantic on its second crossing, taking the title away from a German ship, the Kaiser Wilhelm II. We're going to talk about that later. As I said, the English government wanted naval superiority, and they also wanted it for military use if it was ever needed. Now remember, this was built back in 1906, and the war didn't really start until for all intent and purposes, 1914. So they were really, but they knew that there was something coming. They had other wars that were ongoing at the time, and they knew that there was a lot of other action that would lead to war. So they wanted to have these reserve vessels for military use if they were ever needed. Here's a quote from Sir Charles McLaren, the chairman of John Brown and Company. They were the company that built the ship. He said, "There is not a Briton anywhere who ought not to feel proud that this launch has placed Great Britain firmly at the forefront of marine architecture." One shipbuilding magazine named the occasion of the launch of the Lusitania as a matter transcending in interest every event of the kind for many years, if not in the entire annals of shipbuilding. They also said it was an epoch-making triumph of naval architecture and the most magnificent ship in the world. And it was. At that time, it was. But the big question is, was the Lusitania a warship? So we know that the specifications called for hidden gun mounts. It was designed to carry 12 quick-firing 6-inch guns. It entered dry dock on May of 1913 to be retrofitted with high-power naval rifles, and it certainly could carry troops if needed. Although the Lusitania entered dry dock for the purpose of being retrofitted, and the 6-inch guns were delivered to the shipyard, there's no firm evidence that these guns were ever fitted to the ship. The customs inspector at the New York Harbor, Dudley Field Malone, testified that he had inspected the ship and found no guns installed on the ship. Many passengers from all classes were interviewed, and no one saw any guns at any time. There were accounts in later years that told of guns mounted under the teak decks in areas where no passenger traffic would occur that could quickly be swung into action when needed. Shipyard workers said ammunition magazines and gun mounts were installed, but the guns were never actually placed in the mounts. So let's take a look at how war was viewed back in the early 20th century. At the outset of the war, it was viewed that wars were gentlemanly ventures, as was the case for centuries in Europe. War was a time when heroes were made, when the gentry added ribbons to their dinner jackets. Wars gave the next generation something to brag about and stories to tell their children, and it made their elders proud. And this war was expected to be short term, only 6 to 18 months. And besides, any war that was conducted partly on the sea, civilized nations followed the cruiser rules. And so that's basically what the feeling of war was back in those days. But what did it really mean to an individual? Governments needed people to stand behind the war effort. They didn't have an endless supply of money that seems to be the way we conduct wars today. If you wanted to wage war on another nation, you had to state your case and find funding through loans or bond sales. In the US, there were 5 loan campaigns. The first 4 were known as Liberty Loans. The 5th and final was called the Victory Loan. The issues were bought out between the 14th of May, 1917 and the 21st of April, 1919. So in just under 2 years, the total amount of $21.5 billion was raised through these loan efforts. The disposal of this vast amount of obligations was accomplished by direct sales to the people in an unprecedented scale. Liberty Loan Committees were organized in all sections of the country, and almost the entire population was canvassed. 4-minute speakers gave high-powered sales talks in theaters, motion picture houses, hotels, and restaurants. The clergymen of the country made pleas for the purchase of bonds from their pulpit. Mass meetings were held on occasion, and the banks assisted by lending money at the rate of no higher than the interest on the bonds to those who could not afford to purchase the bonds outright. In this way, it was possible to secure the funds needed to obtain and to obtain oversubscription on each issue. So even if you didn't have money yourself to buy a Liberty bond, you could go to the bank, borrow the money from them, and then buy the bond held in your name, and you wouldn't have to pay it back until afterward when the government paid you. So wars were financed through bonds. The British government and later the US government felt that people needed to hate Germans, not just the German government, in order to want to kill them. And one recruiting poster asked sportsmen or hunters to enlist so that they could hunt the ultimate prey, humans, Germans. Submarines were viewed as ugly, cranky contraptions that no civilized nation would ever use in war. The English Navy had 61 subs in 1914, but only 17 were fit to operate outside coastal waters. The German Navy had 21 fully operational U-boats capable of circumnavigating the British Isles and not restricted to the heavily guarded English Channel. So let's look at the countries and their leaders. Some people came to view this the Great War as a family squabble. After all, it may surprise you to learn that Great Britain's King George V and Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II were first cousins. Both, in fact, were grandsons of Queen Victoria. Might further surprise you to learn that Tsar Nicholas II was King George's first cousin on his mother's side. And furthermore, Nicholas's wife Alexandria was also a direct descendant of Queen Victoria and was a first cousin of both King George and Kaiser Wilhelm. So this was really was a family affair. It embroiled the whole world, but it was really something that could have been probably, if they sat down at a family dinner, they probably could have solved their problems. Now let's look at the events, the world events that actually led up to the Great War. The Balkan Wars had just concluded in 1912 to 1913, and on July 28th of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria occurred. At that point, countries began to align according to past treaties, alliances, and pacts. Austria declared war on Serbia on July 28th, the actual day of the assassination. Germany declared war on Russia a few days later, and France a couple days after that. And Great Britain declared war on Germany. So you have all these different countries that are involved in the war now, going by past alliances and treaties and declaring war on one another. The British Admiralty ordered British merchant ships to defy the cruiser rules, attack subs or ram them, treat captured submarine crews as felons, not POWs, and Great Britain announced the blockade of the North Sea. So what are the cruiser rules? In a war zone, a ship was asked to halt an unarmed ship with a shot across the bow, search the ship, and if the ship is neutral and carrying no contraband, they should let it go. If the ship was a merchant ship belonging to a rival nation, the crew and passengers became hostages. Cargo and ship was seized as a prize of war. But Winston Churchill, the first Lord of the Admiralty, changed those rules. He armed merchant ships. He made it an offense to obey a U-boat's order to halt. Captains were ordered to engage the enemy with any armament they possessed and to ram the sub if they lacked arms. Any captain that surrendered a ship would be prosecuted. There were a lot of cartoons in both the US and the English papers of the time, just like there are political cartoons today. This one happens to show Uncle Sam kind of chastising John Bull, who is the patriotic figure of Great Britain. It says, Britannia must be more careful how she waives the rules. So Germany, in response to this, Germany broadens the war zone and announces the blockade of all British and Irish coastal waters and unrestricted submarine warfare, and it begins sinking all ships, even neutral ships, because British ships began flying flags of neutral nations. In fact, on the 16th of January 1915, the Lusitania herself, on a trip from New York to Queenstown, the Lusitania flew the US flag to guarantee a safe passage. So even the Lusitania was using a neutral flag to try to get through the war waters safely. And this cartoon appeared. It says John Bull uses the American flag for protection, and he says, as he's standing on the deck of the Lusitania, "Can't you see I'm a bloomin' Yankee?" Following this incident, Germany sent a letter to President Wilson with a proposal to certify neutral ships. These ships would be painted with distinctive colors and stripes, would sail from certified ports at designated times, but America had to agree that these ships would carry no contraband whatsoever. All these proposals were sternly rejected by the president. The German embassy issued warnings to all potential passengers. Telegrams were sent to ticketed passengers of the May 1st sailing, and Cunard replied to those people that the Lusitania was built to withstand an attack. It could outrun any sub and would be escorted through the channel by the Juno. So they were saying that, oh, Germany is just bluffing. They're just pounding their chest, but we have it covered. This is in fact the ad that was placed next to Cunard's sailing notice. And it reads that travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters. Liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Although the ad claimed to be placed by the German embassy, in the years following the sinking, it was discovered that many of the ads were paid for and placed by a group of German Americans who wanted the US to remain neutral. They did, however, clear the message through the German military attaché. So the Lusitania sailed from New York on May 1st, 1915, carrying 51 tons of 3-inch shells, 6 million rifle cartridges, a large amount of gun cotton, 1,248 cases of shrapnel, and 200 tons of ammunition. On the day of the sinking, the Admiralty, which had told the captain that he would be escorted by the Juno, a British warship, the Admiralty pulled the Juno escort. They directed him to use the same course used in previous crossings. Captain Turner slowed down to avoid low tide, so he slowed down to only using 3 of those 4 turbines. And with information that was a full 1 day late, Turner changes his course directly into the path of a waiting sub. He also was not given the order to zigzag, as had been ordered of all other ships in the war zone. So what were the attitudes prior to the sinking? In Germany, Lusitania, they said that the Lusitania is being used for troop movements from Canada to the UK. The Lusitania carries munitions from neutral US to the war zone. We know that's true. Passengers have been warned that the Lusitania is a British ship traveling in the war zone. In Great Britain, they of course denied that the Lusitania was being used for troop movements. They denied that the Lusitania carried munitions. They further stated that the Lusitania could outrun a submarine because of its superior speed, and they felt Germany is bluffing. They would never sink a passenger ship. No one would stoop that low. The attitude in the United States was, well, the United States wanted to remain neutral. They believed that the Lusitania could outrun a submarine because of its superior speed. They believed Germany was bluffing. They reminded Germany, however, that any act against Americans would be met with consequences. In fact, the United States was supplying munitions to both sides. They were supplying food to all of Europe. And the US economy was booming because of the war. Neutrality allowed commerce with both sides. 27% of the US population at that time was German. The Irish population that was in the United States were not exactly behind the British effort. Jewish citizens tended to side with Germany because Germany was fighting the tyranny of the Russian czars. However, Great Britain had borrowed large sums of money from the US banks. And Great Britain was spending $10 million a day in the US on the war effort. Because of the spending and investments involved, the US government tended to be more pro-British. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty and has long been suspected of knowing more about the circumstances of the attack than he let on in public, wrote in a confidential letter shortly before the sinking that some German submarine attacks were to be welcomed. He said, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the US with Germany. For our part, we want the traffic, the more the better. And if some of it gets into trouble, better still." So the Lusitania was torpedoed on May 7th, 1915, off the old head of Kinsale within sight of the Irish coast. It sank in 18 minutes. 1,201 people were killed, of which 128 were Americans. And although only 1 torpedo was fired by that German sub, several explosions were heard. The New York Times headline the next day was, "The Lusitania was sunk by a submarine, probably 1,260 dead, twice torpedoed off the Irish coast." So they were buying into the theory that more than 1 torpedo had landed, had been issued from the sub. And it says that it sank in 15 minutes. Captain Turner was saved. However, Frohman and Vanderbilt were missing. These were two highly successful Americans that were on board at the time. It says, "Washington believes that a grave crisis is at hand." So after the sinking, Great Britain, of course, was outraged that a passenger ship would be the target of the German war effort. They denied that the Lusitania carried munitions capable of exploding. Now, that's important, the way they stated that, because as I read that list of things that were on the Lusitania, none of that in and of itself was capable of exploding. The cartridges, of course, had to be loaded into other weapons, and the gun cotton had to first be loaded into a shell in order to be used. So they carefully chose their words. The munitions were not capable of exploding. And they asked neutral nations to join them against Germany. Germany, of course, said the Lusitania was armed and carrying munitions from the neutral US to the war zone, thus causing the ship to explode and rapidly sink following the single torpedo strike. Furthermore, passengers were warned that the Lusitania was a British ship traveling in the war zone, and Germany had a right to protect the German population from armed ships in the war zone. In the US, President Wilson still hoped to remain neutral. He stated that Germany should pay reparations for the sinking, and he reminded Germany that any further acts against Americans would be met with consequences. You might recall that that's what he said the first time. However, former President Theodore Roosevelt, who was never one to back down from a good fight, stated, "It seems inconceivable that we can refrain from taking action in this matter, for we owe it not only to humanity, but to our own national self-respect." So I'm going to let you decide who benefited from the sinking. Was it Germany or Great Britain? Germany hoped to show neutral nations that Great Britain was willing to risk innocent lives by loading their passenger liners with munitions while sending innocent people into the war zone. And Kaiser Wilhelm estimated a large number of German Americans, thought to be around 500,000 at the time, were pro-German and would urge the US to join the German war effort. He considered them to be his reserve army. Great Britain hoped to sway neutral nations by proving that Germany had no conscience and would kill innocent people if it furthered their cause. And furthermore, the US had a large number of Irish Americans. Great Britain hoped that they could persuade the US to enter the war on the side of the British. But the US remained neutral, with Americans divided strongly along ancestral lines. They also made note that the Lusitania traveled the same route as prior sailings. The Lusitania did not receive the Admiralty directive to zigzag in the war zone, and the Lusitania did not obey the company's order to stay away from the coast because of active submarine warfare in that area. Lusitania did not receive the Admiralty directive to travel at full speed through the area. Captain Turner was told there would be an escort by a British destroyer. There was no escort. And the message that submarines were active off the Irish coast was delayed 20 hours and given to the Lusitania only 2 hours before the sinking, while it was already strongly on its course to Queenstown. The Lusitania was told to set a course for Queenstown rather than Liverpool. Liverpool would have taken them out into the center of the channel. Excuse me. This new course turned them closer to the Irish coast and directly into the path of a waiting submarine whose location was known to the Admiralty. The ship was within sight of the Irish coast. If the Lusitania was sunk, the response from other ships would be quick and most lives would be saved. And they also pointed out that the Titanic took 2 hours to sink when it struck an iceberg 3 years earlier in 1912. So there were many people that believed that that Great Britain actually wanted the Lusitania to at least be torpedoed, if not sunk, because even if people got into trouble, there would be a quick response from ships. Most of the lives would be saved. And after all, they had about 2 hours to do all of this. Well, it only took 18 minutes to sink. This is in fact the course of both the submarine and the Lusitania, the submarine in red, the Lusitania in green. And as you can see, the submarine went ahead of the Lusitania after it knew its course and came back so that it was approaching the Lusitania on the starboard side. On the morning of the day of the sinking, Colonel E.M. House, the U.S. confidential peace emissary, met with Britain's Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. And while walking through Kew Gardens, Grey asked House, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" And at the exact time of the sinking, Colonel House was meeting with King George V. In his memoirs, he states, "The king stood looking out of the window, one hand toying with some papers on a desk. And with his back to the colonel, he suddenly remarked, 'Colonel, what will America do if the Germans sink the Lusitania?' In the first few days after the sinking, Great Britain planned to dynamite the wreckage. The stated reason was to retrieve bodies from the ship. More importantly, explosions would cause further damage to the ship and make any official inquiry more difficult. It's also been pointed out that by bombing the ship through explosions, that anything of a contraband nature that was on board would also be destroyed. at that time. After the wreckage of the Lusitania was discovered, the English government dropped hundreds of depth charges on the ship. They stated it was for target practice to test new weapons. But Professor William Kingston of Trinity College in Dublin said, "There's no doubt at all about it that the Royal Navy and the British government have taken very considerable steps over the years to try to prevent whatever can be found out about the Lusitania." There was a Board of Trade inquiry. The sinking was investigated by the Wreck Commission and was overseen by John Charles Bingham, or as he was called, Lord Mersey. The Admiralty tried to blame Captain Turner, saying that he was negligent. Lord Mersey determined their evidence was falsified. One member of the inquiry board admitted later that he was instructed by the Board of the Admiralty to find Turner guilty of treasonable behavior. Captain Turner, Cunard, and the Royal Navy were all absolved of any negligence. And their final conclusion was that blame for the disaster must rest solely with those who plotted and with those who committed the crime. The coroner's inquest placed all blame on Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm and absolved Captain Turner of any blame. Lord Mersey, 2 days after he closed the inquiry, waived his fees and resigned. His final comment was, "The Lusitania case was a damn dirty business." Here are two postcards. One again showing the U-20 in close proximity to the sinking ship. And the second was a postcard that was popular at the time, showing two different torpedo strikes, even though it was known that there was only one. This was a postcard showing mass graves on the coast of Ireland where some of the bodies were buried. The sinking began to be used as a propaganda tool. There was a fabricated story that German school children were given a holiday to celebrate the sinking of the Lusitania. And members of the U-20 were supposedly given a special Lusitania medal for their work. We're going to talk about that medal soon. And they also said that the pack of U-boats was assigned to the task to sink the Lusitania. And as she approached, one U-boat made itself visible so the Lusitania would alter its course into the path of another waiting sub. This was in fact not true. They didn't have to do that. The Admiralty itself changed the course of the Lusitania into the path of a waiting sub. There was a passenger on board, Elbert Hubbard. And there was also a rumor that the Kaiser actually sent a vessel out to sink the Lusitania because he wanted to kill Elbert Hubbard, who had written a terrible story about him entitled "Who Lifted the Lid Off Hell?" There was a group in East Aurora, New York, called the Roycrofters, and they believed that the Kaiser, in his blind wrath, sent a U-boat to sink the Lusitania because Elbert Hubbard was aboard. Elbert Hubbard called the Kaiser a mastoid degenerate and wrote about his withered arm and leaky ear. So did the Kaiser specifically target the Lusitania? Another propaganda story theorized that Kaiser Wilhelm specifically targeted the Lusitania because it took the blue ribbon from his ship, named in his honor. There were newspaper stories at the time circulating saying that Captain Lieutenant Walter von Schweiger, who was the captain of the U-20, was grief-stricken and hospitalized for insanity following the sinking. In fact, he continued sinking ships until his death on U-88 in September of 1917. Some more cartoons at the time, a bunch of children who were killed on the Lusitania. But why did you kill us? The Kaiser condemned. This was a cartoon put out by the French showing that Uncle Sam is weighing dollars versus the dead. You can see the Lusitania sinking in the background and the Kaiser looking on. This was a war bonds poster, "Help crush the menace of the seas, buy Liberty bonds, buy quickly and buy freely." And there again, you can see the Lusitania in the background. Here's one with the Kaiser waiting in the water, waiting among dead children and other dead passengers. It said, "Only the Navy can stop this." And here's one with Lady Liberty, again, the Lusitania in the background and floating bodies. "Take up the sword of justice." This was one cartoon that showed the intersection of civilization with what they called in Germany Kultur. It depicts the clashing of civilization and German Kultur, which was a term used to describe German cultural characteristics: nationalism, authoritarian, and racism. This was a very popular postcard, but it actually became a recruiting poster also of the sinking of Lusitania. With the you can still see the mast of the ship going down, and a child in a Lusitania life vest, life preserver. Irishmen were asked to join an Irish regiment to avenge the Lusitania. This is another very popular recruiting poster saying simply "enlist," showing a mother clutching her dead baby heading down to the bottom of the ocean. Here's one, remember the Lusitania. It spells out what the jury's verdict was, and at the bottom it says, "It is your duty to take up the sword of justice to avenge this devil's work. Enlist today." This was a postcard put out by Germany, though. It shows Admiral von Tirpitz, and it's actually showing the sinking of the Lusitania with a shot to the opposite side of the ship on the port side. So it's not actually factual, but it was a postcard put out by the Germans. And this is one equating the sinking of the Germany to what had happened to the Titanic 3 years earlier. It says cold-bloodedness, but it's saying that it was another iceberg. Amy talked about in the beginning, when she gave my introduction, about a medal that drew me into this whole story. This is a medal by the German medalist Karl Goetz. It's called "The Sinking of the Lusitania." On the one side, you can see people lining up to buy tickets on the Cunard line from a skeleton. And on the other side, you can see the ship going down. And if you look closely, there are airplanes and cannons and other armament on the deck of the ship. The one thing that I want you to note, though, is the date on the bottom of the right-hand picture. It says 5 May 1915. So that original date was wrong. Goetz used a newspaper article to gather his facts. He was a very good artist, but he wasn't always that good at gathering the proper facts. And he actually wrote down the wrong date when he made the first striking of this. The English government saw the propaganda value of the medal, and they produced 250,000 medals to raise money for the war effort. They capitalized on the use of the word medal and publicly called it a war medal given to the crew of the submarine U-20. In this case, the real phrase should have been commemorative medal or medallion. I'm pointing out the incorrect date here. It's 5 May of 1915. There were, in fact, 5 different versions of this medal authorized. The original Goetz medal was dated 5 May with the German spelling MAI. He corrected it after it was pointed out to him and corrected it to the 7th of May. But the British had already, capitalized on this. And they put out their own dated 5 May with the English spelling. And then they corrected it to 5 MAI, the German spelling, to make it look more authentic. And there was a company in Pennsylvania, of all places, Sandstrom and Mahood, that actually made their own medals with the 5 MAI spelling. And if you look on the internet, you can find any of these medals for sale. Some of them a lot more expensive than others. Of course, the 2 original Goetz medals are very expensive, but the other medals are available, and you can find them in case you get the fever like I did. So Germany's comment after all of this was, the German government desires to express its deepest sympathy at the loss of lives on board the Lusitania. The responsibility rests, however, with the British government, which through its plan of starving the civilian population of Germany, has forced Germany to resort to retaliatory measures. The official US response, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who was asked whether any warning had been given to Americans, His response was, "I think I had better go no further than to say that no warning was given. The German government never called the department's attention to the warning advertisement." And these are the two captains that were involved in the whole event. Captain William Turner and Captain Lieutenant Walter von Schweiger. In the fall of 1916, Turner, at the last minute, was assigned the Ivernia to be captain of the Ivernia when the original captain of the ship was ill. 30 miles off the coast of Greece, that ship was torpedoed, and once again, Turner survived. Soon afterward, Cunard decided that all Turner would be allowed to captain from then on was his desk. Third Officer Albert Bestick came to visit Captain Turner in the fall of 1932, long after the sinking, upon learning that Turner was ill with stomach cancer. Turner's wife, Mabel, answered the door at their house in Liverpool when Bestick called. When she relayed the information to Turner, he said he never heard of Bestick. Bestick was hurt and was about to leave when he suddenly remembered that Turner never called him by his real name. He said, "Would you be so kind as to tell the captain that my name is really Bissett?" Mabel was suspicious, but she returned smiling after delivering the message, saying, "He said, why the hell didn't you say so in the first place?" Turner and Bestick sat down, and Turner recounted stories of his past. When Bestick got his chance, he asked, "The Lusitania, sir, did you think she was going to be torpedoed?" He said, I was worried, Bissett. Naturally I was. What master wouldn't be? I thought we had an odds-on chance of escaping. You know, I didn't get a fair deal. I mean to say, no escort was there to meet us. Despite the signals about submarines, they gave me false confidence. With the Admiralty, they didn't even think it necessary to worry about a ship worth millions, not to mention the thousands or hundreds of passenger lives. I reasoned that they must think there's not much danger. No, I didn't get a fair deal. A good 2 years went by before they started issuing definite orders to other ships. What courses the ship should sail, the distance they should keep off the headlands. I was told if I was told that, I would have taken a mid-channel course. And my ship in the Atlantic, they didn't tell me to zigzag. Mabel continued to take care of Turner until his death in June of 1933. As for von Schweiger, he continued to sink. He continued to serve as a U-boat captain and was also continued to sink many vessels, civilian and armed vessels, until he met his own demise in September of 1917. I'd like to thank you, and if there are any questions, I'd like to take them now.
Thank you, Rick. That was wonderful. Very, very interesting. We do have some questions.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. So it's really hard to believe that they used the ship basically as target practice after it had sunk. Are there any surviving artifacts at all?
Well, there are a few. The propellers actually were salvaged, and they're on display at three different ports, three different naval ports in the Irish coast. But so the propellers, and there were a few other things that were salvaged, but it's been a very delicate operation, and even the owner of the ship now will not send a team down to do anything because the ship itself is collapsing inward under the weight of the water and its rusted condition. So there wasn't really much salvaged from it, unlike the Titanic, which there are many things that were salvaged from the Titanic, although it wasn't carrying any contraband. The other thing the present owner is worried about is if there are any unexploded devices on the ship, he certainly doesn't want to send a salvage team in to uncover those.
That's a good point. Okay, here's another question.
Sure.
It seems as though America benefit as much, if not more, than Britain. Best case scenario, they were war profiteering, and worst case scenario, they were able to enter the war and save Britain, where more of their investments were. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I know where that question came from. I think it came from a very close relative of mine who we have argued this point since he was a child. So, but anyway, yeah, I think he's partially correct. I think that the Great Britain, of course, benefited more so than the U.S., although the U.S. did continue to benefit for 2 more years after the sinking and didn't really declare war until April of 1917. And I don't want to get into this too heavily, but it was really because of the Zimmermann telegram, where Zimmermann, who was the German attaché to the U.S., sent a telegram to Mexico, asking Mexico to declare war on the U.S. that would try to keep us at home. So if we were fighting the Mexicans, we were less likely to enter the war and fight against the Germans. Of course, Mexico declined to do that, knowing that they were in the midst of their own war at the time, internal civil war, and they didn't have the means of doing that. But the Zimmermann telegram, which was actually sent in, I believe, January of 1917, but was declared to be authentic by Zimmermann in March of 1917, quickly within 3 weeks after he said that it was, or I would say a month after he said it was legitimate, we declared war on Germany.
So another question is, you did a great job of explaining the point of view from both sides. Well, what is your personal opinion?
Oh, my personal opinion has always been that the British they felt this was the way to get the U.S. into the war. They wanted the U.S. on their side. There was a lot of talk back then, and I have many newspapers and excuse me, magazines of the time that show that the U.S. German-American population was heavily lobbying the U.S. government to enter into the war on the side of the Germans. But my feeling is that the British actually allowed the ship to be sunk. I think they allowed it to be torpedoed, thinking that the ship would not sink and that they would be able to rescue it that close to shore. There wouldn't be any injuries or deaths, and that it would still show the world that the Germans were capable of doing this to a passenger liner. The fact that it actually did sink in 18 minutes, I think, I won't call it a bonus for them, because certainly that many lives lost is not a bonus, but it did certainly get the Americans and others on their side.
Well, it was certainly very, very fascinating. And we thank you so much for being with us this evening and sharing this history with us. I know I learned something, and I'm sure many people in our audience did as well, too.
Very good. Thank you
so much for joining us, and we hope to see you for next month's third Thursday lecture. That will be on June 18th. Thank you again, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.